Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today you're getting a glimpse into my father's bedroom. You've actually been in here a few times whenever I've recently been recording with Charlie. Today I wanted to run through my top 10 books for the first quarter of this year. This is something that I did last year, so I recorded a top 10 for each quarter of the year. And then at the end of the year, I had the books duke it out to see which ones would make it onto my top 10 for the year overall. And I should have probably created a playlist for this, but I didn't, so just imagine. Either way, I'm aware that it's May. It's a month and a bit after I should be recording this video. But this year, we've been even more lackadaisical than we ordinarily are. I mean, you're on a tripod on an old bureau that belonged to some dead relative. In no particular order, the first book that I want to mention as making it into my top 10 for the first quarter of the year is Lucy by the Sea by Elizabeth Strout. This is the fourth book in the Lucy Barton series and is set at the beginning of the pandemic and then follows it through for a certain amount of time. It really reflects on the period of uncertainty that we all felt going through the pandemic and does that utilising characters that we've come to know and adore. And one of the reasons that this book is on this list is that Elizabeth Strout writes in such an accessible fashion that it feels as though Lucy Barton is speaking to you directly. And again, this is a character, and another book on this list does the same thing, where as I'm reading, I became so enthralled in Lucy's story that I completely forgot that she was a fictional character. And there was this period at the 230 page mark where I realised that this wasn't real. And I think as readers, that's the experience that we're always looking for, is the idea that this actually happened and that these characters exist. And there was almost this sort of heartbreak to realise that Lucy isn't real, but the stories that she's relating within here, which also bring in a few of Strout's characters from her other works, such as the protagonist from the Burgess Boys, and we even get to hear about Olive Kitteridge and Amy and Isabel. To hear how all of these characters cope, it did make it feel more real. Just thoroughly adore Strout's writing. It's so accessible, so easy, but there's so much going on beneath the surface, and she writes books that I want to go back to and explore the characters' lives again. I think that she is a superb writer. Then I have Cat Lady by Dawn O'Porter, and I'm not really sure how this book made it onto this list, because for a while there I was thinking of unhauling this book. So the protagonist in this book, whose name I believe is Mia. It is! Mia has joined a grief support group for pet owners, despite the fact that her pet hasn't died, but you get the sense that she's dealing with some unresolved grief or unresolved emotions, and she's trying to find some outlet for that. She is married to a man whose ex-wife is constantly there, and you get the idea that she actually does love her cat more than anything else on the planet. This book did something that I called the Great Unravelling when I read it, which was it pulled apart the character of Mia and then it built her back up again by the end of the novel, and it did it in a way that at times was humorous and at times was tragic. This is a book that I still haven't lent to my sister, which actually goes to show how sporadic her visits have been this year. I think it's a great novel for lovers of contemporary fiction who might want something with a little bit more bite. I did not expect to enjoy this book as much as I did. I did think that it's a one and done type book, but it was very successful in doing that and creating characters that, well, sometimes I might not have thought they were entirely believable, I did sympathise with, and again, although there was a predictability about the novel, I did like the way in which Dawn O'Porter wrote it, and some of the things that she got up to in this book. The hijinks, the dissolution of the character and the rebuilding of her, it was all just done incredibly well. Then we have translations by Brian Friel. So here, we have a town whose name I did learn to say at the time, but I've forgotten it by now. Was it Ballybeg? Ballybide? Oof. You know, it told me at the time and I've forgotten. Ballybeg. And it's an Irish-speaking community in County Donegal in 1833, and this teacher is trying to teach the Irish-speaking people English. And it really talks about all of the awful things that the English did to the Irish in the 1800s. But it also is a delightful play about language and community. I'm really fond of thinking about the way things sound, and I'm really fond of language. And that's why this play appealed to me. I received this in a Secret Santa as part of KD Books Plec. And I've no idea who sent it to me. One day, someone is going to get in touch and they're going to tell me that they sent me this, and I'm going to be able to thank them because it is a truly fantastic play. That another book that's made it onto this list, which is Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. Reading translations and then reading Trespasses was great for me because I'm sure that there is some intertextuality there, and I'm sure that they're connected to each other in some way, even if it's not overtly said. And having read Brian Friel's translations beforehand and then going into Trespasses, it was great to think about the way in which we can use language as power. And I'm not just saying the words in which we speak, I'm talking about an actual language, like predominantly forcing people to learn English to the point that a person's own language, their mother tongue, is lost. And then to go into Trespasses and to read about these people who are trying to get back in touch with their heritage and trying to learn this language that so few people know now, added a different layer to my experiences of reading Trespasses. This is one of those tales with a propulsive narrative, and as I say, it harkens back to a lot of Irish literature. And what I say that this book did well was that it looked at an ordinary situation, people's ordinary lives, whilst something superbly extraordinary and dark was going on around them. And we had the focus of this character of somebody who was just trying to get through life. And even though her experiences might seem somewhat mundane and prosaic in the grand scheme of things, the normalisation of Molotov cocktails and the pipe bombs and the car bombings and the way in which this has almost become part of the everyday, and the way that was talked about was not only engaging but very thought-provoking. And I just think that Louise Kennedy writes superbly, and this book had me enraptured. So I suppose that I should also talk about another book from the Women's Prize long list. I don't think it made the shortlist, but that is Wandering Souls by Cecile Pinn. Charlie and I had been hoping that this book would make it on to the long list, and when it did, we were thrilled. I have to say, it didn't necessarily live up to my expectations, but it's still on this list because it did deal with a few themes that I like to see talked about, which is the theme of death, and I like a family saga, and they are both present here. When I first heard the blurb for this book, I'd hoped for something along the lines of The Seven Moons of Marley Almeida, which I read and adored last year. Indeed, it won the Booker. Not that I had anything to do with that, but it did do that. I think that because I'd read that book, and I've read so many books doing this thing of exploring a ghost story alongside a normal narrative, I'd seen it done better elsewhere. And there were a few times within the book where I felt like the author had included certain passages that weren't necessary to the overall telling of the tale. 2 chapters about the perspective of American soldiers, for instance, didn't really go anywhere. And I do feel like the author needed to expand upon what she was writing about, or cut back what she was writing about and really home in on the themes and ideas for just one book. But I get that a lot of debut novelists do this. I did it with the book that I independently published many years ago. You just throw everything at it. Every idea that's come into your head you put into this book, and I think that that's what happened with Wandering Souls. To continue along this vein about the Women's Prize for Fiction, I want to talk about Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And this is a book that I struggled with in the beginning because I kept likening it to David Copperfield, and I kept seeing instances where certain themes, ideas, and things that were happening and plot points were a twist on something that had happened in David Copperfield. And I think that that's to the book's detriment, really, because the two books are actually entirely separate. And as I moved further along into the book, and I really slowed down my reading, and that is what had to be done. I think that I'd gone into this book with the idea that I could just breeze through it, and for me it took time, and I needed to put the book aside because there are some darker themes in here. It's talking about the opioid crisis in the 90s, and it's talking about some very tough topics. I was reading this book having read Prozac Nation, so I'd read about that there, and then I was reading about this here, and I think that for me it was just a bit too much darkness in reading for one moment. But Kingsolver is a favourite writer of mine. Yes, there have been times when she has written books that I've not cared for, which, like her first book, The Bean Trees, if that had been the first thing that I'd ever read by Kingsolver, then I never would have read anything else by her. But The Lacuna is the first ever book, going back to Lucy by the Sea, where I read a book and I'd forgotten the author's note in the beginning where the author had written that this character was not real, and to remember that. And with Demon Copperhead, once again, we have a character whose voice is captured so incredibly well, and Kingsolver just has this way of capturing the rhythm and the cadences of language. This is not necessarily a story with a happy ending, but there's a believable ending and there's a sense of hope. And that was something that I very much liked when it came to my reading of this book. So let's talk about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. So I have now I've read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I've listened to, what are they called? The Restaurant at the End of the Universe and Life, the Universe and Everything. Having them read by Martin Freeman has really heightened my experience of reading these books, and I would like to listen to this book again. These books were everywhere, and I think have been everywhere for, well, this was the 42nd anniversary edition. So when did the first book originally come out? So it was first published in 1979. And so I've known about these books for my entire life. Well, not my entire life, but at least since I was about 8 years old. And I first saw the book in my school library, and I didn't pick it up. And I had friends whose parents had read the books to them. And when the film with Martin Freeman came out, they were all very enthusiastic about that. And naturally, then all of the fans appeared and didn't care for the adaptation. I was working on a secret project last year that I haven't really talked about. It was just something on the side that I'd got inspired to write, and the general genre of it, and the way in which it was written just kept in my mind, reminding me of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, even though I hadn't read it. And it came up on one of these streaming platforms last year, and I thought, let's just give it a watch. We aren't doing anything. Watched it, adored it, asked for the book for Christmas, read the book, then watched the television adaptation from the 1980s, and have now listened to more of the books, found out that Douglas Adams wrote the first Doctor Who serial that I ever watched, which was The Pirate Planet. And yeah, I've just found a series that is completely matches my sensibilities and my humour, and I do wish that I had seen it when I was younger and I'd read it when I was younger, but I kept putting it off, and I'm just glad that I have managed to get to it now, and I look forward to continuing to read and listen to this series and just experience them over and over again. Then I have You Will Never Be Forgotten by Mary South. A volunteer of ours read this collection because she loves short stories, brought it to me one day and asked me to read it because she read this book and said that it made her question whether she actually liked not love stories. She said that this book made her question whether she liked short stories as a form. I ended up reading this collection and I absolutely adored it. I think that Mary South is a fantastic writer, and as a collection, if this is what you're putting out into the world, I said it at the time, I would love to see a novel from this writer. I know that sometimes short story writers aren't the best novelists, but I don't know, there are so many ideas in here that I would love for her to take and for her to explore in longer form. The final story in here had an image within it that I had to put the book down, send a message to Charlie talking about my disgust and sadness at this story, and then I returned to the book 12 hours later because I needed it to just... If you didn't know, the author says that the stories in here are exploring the theme of grief, and these are tales that can be surreal, they can be futuristic. It is something that you can see is that knowing the author was writing about grief in its various forms, it became a Charlie book just because of that, because I always like to see the way in which an author is going to explore that theme. And that final story, exploring grief in such a fashion, was something that I could understand, but was also disturbing. And I think that it's fantastic when an author can disturb you in such a way. That's the thing, is that although, and I agree with the volunteer at the time, there are stories in here where it felt as though the author might be leaning into a gimmick to tell her tale, I still liked what the author had to say, and it's a collection that I could see myself going back to the same way that you go back to a favourite album and you take your time to really mull over everything that the author's saying. It's one of those where you read it once, perhaps for the entertainment value, and then you keep rereading it, not for entertainment purposes, but to just re-engage and re-immerse yourself into the worlds that the creator has created. To re-immerse yourself into the worlds that the writer has created. That sounded much better syntactically. And now the next two books are both by the same author, and that is Kate Atkinson. If you have been following my channel at all this year, then you will have known that I have really been blitzing through the Kate Atkinson books this year. And that all started because I found a copy of Emotionally Weird at work, and I could not remember why my friend Joy had loaned me this book nearly 12 years ago now. So this book was going into the bin and I borrowed it, and then I started remembering why the book had been loaned to me, but also using my reading of this book to inform a book that I'm currently working on. And Emotionally Weird is a book that a lot of Kate Atkinson fans do not like, because Kate Atkinson is mocking literary forms in here, left, right and centre. It is the tale of a young woman, as quite a few of Kate Atkinson's early works do, and she is telling a story to her mother, who is not her mother, on a small island in Scotland, having left her university in Dundee, I think it was, and then we go back to hear about her university days, but sometimes her mother will interject into the story and say, no, there's too many characters here, get rid. And so when you go back to that scene, there'll be fewer characters than there were before. Or if a death happens or something where the mother can't really see the daughter can't see a way out of the story, she'll do something magical or mystical and say, well, that's postmodernism for you, and not explain it. And I can understand why this book has rather low reviews and ratings when it comes down to it, but I adore that about it. I found it so humorous and so experimental, and it's not by any means the most experimental book that I've ever read, but this is a book that made me understand when certain people have come to me and they said that they just opened a book and read certain passages to remember why they adore the writer. This is a book that sent me into reading more of Kate Atkinson, which is why Life After Life is also on this list. But Emotionally Weird, despite the fact that I read it years ago and I wouldn't ordinarily put it on a top 10 then, I just couldn't keep it off this list. Not least because I needed to keep up numbers, but because it's just helped me creatively, and it's also a book that I keep just picking up and reading a few pages, despite the fact that I've already read it once this year, and I put it back down and I pick it up and I start again, and I've nearly got through that book twice this year, despite the fact that I'm not really reading it all the time, but I just enjoy going back and seeing Kate Atkinson just play around with form. And Life After Life is on here because I've been trying to get this book read for years, since it first came out, and this was a book that, when I just say about going back to a book and reading it and understanding why you'd go back and you'd just read it and you'd open it and read a few pages and then put the book down just to enjoy the author's writing again, that is what Joy told me she did with Life After Life. This is the book in which Ursula is born, Ursula dies, and then she dies again, and then she's born again, and we keep going back to certain points in Ursula's life and seeing how her life could have gone had she followed a different path. I finally finished it, and I read it, and I adored it, and I understood why so many people held this up as the pinnacle of prose from Kate Atkinson. For me, having read more of her work now, it does feel like a culmination of all her themes and ideas. We have family, we have the tale of sisters, we have this loop of time going back and forth all the time, but also it's a different way of exploring the Second World War, in that we're getting to see all these different sorts of lives that women led during the war and what it meant for them having gone through all of that. It also feels the cleanest in terms of prose. Now, I have very much enjoyed reading Kate Atkinson's early work and getting to see her where she's being a bit more humorous and a bit more flippant. But this one did feel somewhat steady in its craft, as though the author really took her time and thought about everything. And I don't say that to denigrate any of her earlier works, because I really have enjoyed reading them this year. It just felt somewhat masterful, like you were in reliable hands with this book. Them's the books. Those are my top 10 books from January until March in 2023, and hopefully I'm able to cobble together another top 10 from April to June. Is that right? April, May, June. Yes, it is correct. And you should get to see that video at the start of July, but you know me and timing this year. So all I'll say is, what books have made it to your top 10 in the first 3 months of the year? Have you read any fantastic books this year so far, or are you still waiting for that book that properly hooks you? Have you read any of these books? Feel free to talk about them in the comments. I hope that you have got something out of this video, even if it was just the pleasure of looking at my father's blue walls, because until next time, that is all.